The ridgeline meta in World of Tanks is one of the biggest and most annoying things about the game, because not only does it seem very simple from the point of view of a Unicum, but it can be so annoying to be able to actually pull off in the game, because you have to know quite a few different things and be able to be in the right tank in the right position to make it work. And today's video is going to look at exactly that. So let's kick it off with, of course, one of the best tanks in the game at being able to do that, the UDES 1516, the tier 10 Swedish vehicle capable of being able to kick out an inordinate amount of damage in every single shell, competing with a lot of heavy tanks at the tier and being able to dominate a lot of the other medium tanks that you'll be facing, because you have the higher alpha damage and you have the turret armor that makes this tank absolutely superb. And straight away we are seeing a game on our favorite Muravanka, and this is a brilliant position for using your ridgelines because of the fact that you can get into a position like this where you can really counter a lot of the opponents. You have to take that early game position, you have to rush in to be able to get there quickly enough to be able to get into somewhere like this where you catch the opponents crossing before they get to fully cross. And this is the ultimate farm. You really can't expect a whole lot more, and this is one position that you can use in your tanks. You just have to be very careful about looking at the enemy team's composition before you decide to get into this location, and it can give you a ton of damage. It's one of the really nice places to be able to use, and as you can see, he's picked up 5,000 damage already within this game, which is crazy, and it only gets better as you kind of learn these early game positions, and it's often how Unicums and the higher skilled players in the game are able to have results like this, where they pick up so much damage at the beginning that they then have the flexibility towards the end of the game, and because they've had such an impact at the beginning, they can then deal what they want to do in the later game as they beat a flank, and they can successfully find opponents who are going to be forced to look in multiple directions. And that's exactly what's happened to the enemy team here. They have now been kind of almost encircled, and yeah, it can be a real problem. But one thing that isn't a problem is, of course, fighting on ridgelines like this with the 1516, because as you can see, he can kind of crest over, he can use this ridgeline. As you can see, very difficult to be able to hit the actual hull armor of the UDES 1516 because of the gun depression that it does get, and that is what makes this thing so annoying and infuriating to play up against. As I'm sure you well know, when this thing is played properly, it can be a bit of a monster, and is one of the kind of my most favoured tanks of this kind of nature. But unfortunately, it takes a hit from a Gorilla 15 who's camping in the bushes at the back over here near the cap circle, and of course probably retreating back to the other side of the map where the enemy team have been. But as you could see, just utilising one position at the beginning of the game in the right position for your tank can have a huge impact, and that's what I wanted to show you at the start of this video. Now the next tank then in today's video is looking at what happens when the early game doesn't necessarily happen as easily as the previous one, and we're seeing a less traditional hold down tank in that this one doesn't get a turret. It is the Cheeto SP, the tier 7 Japanese TD that is, to all intents and purposes, very, very, very powerful in the game, and we're going to see it used really, really well here. But I wanted to showcase it is that, you know, sometimes everything isn't absolutely perfect within your games, and you're going to have to do something. It isn't going to end up like you saw with the first replay, in that, you know, you can farm up 9,000 damage within the first couple of minutes of the game starting, obviously. But with the Cheeto SP, obviously you're limited without having a turret, and not having a turret in the game can be, let's just say, a little bit painful to say the least when you're coming up against opponents that have a brain. But if you can work this tank and you understand how these non-turreted tanks actually work, you can out damage a lot of the tanks even if they know what they're doing. And so this tank actually has a decent amount of turret armor. It does have a cupola that is on top of the vehicle, but it is relatively difficult to be able to hit, especially when you're using the gun depression this tank gets. But it does have a lower plate that can be penned, or this kind of flat plate at the bottom of the vehicle which can be penned. The side armor can be penned quite easily, and so maintaining your front horizontal armor towards the opponent is a key to success when playing in vehicles like this and basically any non-turreted tank destroyer. And you can see that what he's doing is just prepping himself, making sure that he pulls back as quickly as possible after firing, giving the opponents that tiny bit of time to try and connect a shell, and most often they're probably not going to be able to do that, especially if you're fighting heavies that don't have good aim time and accuracy in the first place. So that is key to success number one when using a less flexible tank that has decent gun depression and you're using it on a ridgeline, which is yeah, really good. And of course then just able to pick up a few shots here and there between the opponents and try and win this game. Now then, obviously sometimes you have to actually leave your hill, and that is exactly what he's done here. He picked up a few damaging hits using that exact same position, and you guys get the drill. We don't need to go into watching him being able to pick up multiple shots using the exact same position and opponents just throwing themselves away. But how does an opponent take away from that hill position to find other alternatives? Well, what he's done here is he's recognized that the southern half of the map are starting to fail and the enemy team is starting to kind of go through the motions in that they're going to try and encircle around his team. So how do you combat that? Well, essentially in order to kind of stop that encirclement, you have to do one of two things. Either you decide to go back and you try and defend one flank, because at the end of the day you have to break through one of the two flanks that are going to be the places where you're going to get encircled from. Otherwise, you're then going to be fighting on two fronts. You're going to always be exposing the back of your tank to someone, and then of course you're going to get taken out very quickly. So what he decides is he's got to take out this northeastern side of the enemy's team. And so that's exactly what he's done, pushed in, got some damage, and now he has the flexibility once again of using the hills, which is good for his vehicle. But obviously, as I say, you can't just sit around on a hill for the entire game, because yes, you might have a fantastic turret, but sometimes you're not going to have the opportunity to use that because there is just so many opponents left. So the kind of way in which he deals with this is pushing into the town, finishing off a couple of opponents, and then starting to figure out what the best game plan is from here. And essentially the best game plan is to start taking out some of these low health vehicles that are at the end of the game. It's just him and a light tank left alive. He finishes off one of the low health vehicles. They are all basically very low, bar the enemy kind of a tier 7 E75, which is a bit of a pain in the backside anyway, but hopefully he's going to be able to catch another one of these out. And he finds himself a super chaffy out in the open, and it's good night to him. But E25, MT25, T3485, these are all vehicles that are a little bit strong at their tier if they're used correctly. The MT25 probably less so, but it's actually quite an underrated vehicle nonetheless, and if he gets around the back of him, he's going to have troubles. Now, this is the bit that I wanted to show, is that rather than trying to go in after the E25, he pulls back, uses this minute ridge that he actually has available to him to avoid taking a few shells as the E25 comes in, and that saves him a little bit of potential damage. And uh-oh, it seems like the T3485 made a mistake, and MT25, is he going to be able to get around him? And uh-oh, he actually runs into the opponent here, and then he's going to find a bit of trouble. Is he going to have the rotation speed to actually hit this guy? He does, and there you go. The MT25 not looking so good right now, and then instead of going around and continuing to try and go around, throws the game, and the Cheeto comes out with a win in a ridiculous fashion. 6,000 damage, and yeah, 11 enemies taken out within this game. So it's not all about ridgelines for the entire game, but it's about moving between ridgelines when you have tanks like this. Now then, not everything goes perfectly in a lot of your games, which is why we see so many games that end up with 15-0, but how can you still make them work? And that is exactly what we're gonna hopefully showcase in this replay right here, which is in the T832, which is a very powerful vehicle when you can use it correctly and when you have the turret that this thing actually has. It's very strong. It has a cupola that can be penned, but it is very difficult to be able to actually hit, especially when it's using its gun depression, which is ultimately everything about fighting on a ridgeline, you do have to have some degree of gun depression for the most part. But you're seeing here very, very good use of being able to bait opponents into shooting you early, and therefore, you know, you can then pull around and you can get much better shots into a lot of these opponents. Now, unfortunately, Tiger 1 on the enemy team deciding he's going to fire HE, which can be a bit of a problem. But as you can see, there is a ton of vehicles directly in front of him, and when you look at his team, he's got an IS-2 that's camping at the back, a T-103 that's supporting him somewhat, and a Renegade also up here with him, which to all intents and purposes is okay, but it's not perfect at all, because as soon as these tanks realize they can just come down and farm up these the T-832 or maybe overpeak like the BZ for example, you can end up getting taken out really, really quickly. And it's the ultimate thing of fighting on a ridgeline, is that you need to almost put up a facade that you are going to be able to deal with the opponents and keep them at bay by just being a nuisance and slow peaking into a very, very fast peak that then the opponents aren't expecting, because you were slowly moving out and then you suddenly go and then they kind of bounce off of you, and you do have to take an occasional risk here and there and trade your hit points throughout the engagements that are like these, because if you don't, you'll get all of your hit points removed within a couple of seconds when the enemy team realize that you don't have very many teammates, or if your teammates all get taken out and you're left alone by just purely trading their hit points and letting your teammates take the hits for the entire time, which is what a lot of people get wrong. They try and play it too safe within their games, especially when you have a tank like this. You can be confident in being able to bounce rounds, and although it might not happen every single time, you might not bounce every round, it is definitely a much higher possibility of doing that at this stage in the game than it is when there's 5 tanks surrounding you from all directions. So yes, finding that fine line between being aggressive and also being too passive is the difficult option, or the difficult bit about playing these ridgeline tanks. And so especially when you have vehicles like the BZ-176 that genuinely from the front really don't have any weak points except from a very, very minuscule cupola, and they are very dangerous because they can deal so much damage in one. But this is where you have to be quite sure in your ability to lock down the tracks and make sure that you do pen when you do poke, because if you do take a hit, you have to be sure that at least it was worth one shell and that you're removing some of their hit points for being able to do that. And that's exactly what's happened here. His team and him have been able to take out the entire flank, which is very, very crucial, because not only has this game not gone very well in terms of from the beginning, in that there was a lot of vehicles over here that could potentially take them out, but their entire team, who have been in the middle and in the base, have started slowly dying to the enemy team, who would also push the eastern side of the map. And so now he's got to try and deal with that in this later stage when there aren't so many ridges that he can use. But how do you combat that? Well, luckily Lakeville has some really good spots for you to be able to do that when defending the base, which is right here. You can see he's using this hold down location and finding himself once again being able to use the turret and making sure that he's confident throughout the game. And confidence in World of Tanks is one of the biggest things. Like, a lot of the time you can be confident in your vehicles, but sometimes you'll feel too scared to be able to make plays. But equally, if you don't make any plays, you feel like, you know, you're not doing anything, and then slowly over time your teammates get dwindled down by the opponents. You've done nothing in that period of time, and then, yeah, like I said, you get surrounded by opponents. So it's about finding that position where not only do you have a tank that is capable of using it in such a way that you can go hold down, but it's also about making sure that you feel like you can actually use the tank. It's so much having a turret, but if you're not using it, then what's the point? And so yeah, if you're not dealing damage and you're not trying to deal damage throughout the game, you're not going to be able to do it. And it may seem like a very, very simple oversimplification of how to play a hold down tank, but a lot of the time people are just a bit too scared. And if it means poking every now and again where you're not using your turret, sometimes you have to do that too, especially if it's going to dig someone out that is kind of a counter to the position that you're in. And that's exactly what the Lorraine 40T was, until he's been able to farm up the Lorraine and be able to move to this location, where once again he's found a hold down location. It's World of Hold Down, as I'm sure you guys know from this point in the game. But obviously with 6.8k damage down, he's had a fantastic round of World of Tanks, and from here it's just a case of farming up the rest of the opponents who are trying to push in as well. And if you can't always find yourself a hold down location, sometimes you can use your teammates as hold down locations instead. And that's exactly what he's done here, using the UDES on his team, pushing him out so that he provides cover from the Lorraine 40T, which was kind of the counter to this spot. But because he's provided the cover himself, he no longer has to really worry about the Lorraine being able to reliably hit him in the side of the turret, for example, when he's trying to deal with the VZ. And it's just a nice little extra thing that you can think about in your games. It might not be the case every game, of course, but if you think about these things and they're constantly in your mind as to how you can create opportunities, then it's going to make you a way better player. And often people just don't really think about it, and then they realize way too late that maybe they could have done this. So just keep that in the back of your mind, that even a dead teammate can be a useful one. Hopefully this video has given you a few insights as to how pro players use ridgelines to be able to come out with ridiculous results and carry much better than a lot of other players. And it's only those small minute changes in gameplay that can change your damage result by almost 2 times, and hopefully that's come across within this video. But if you have liked the video and you want to see some more before you decide to subscribe, then I highly recommend checking out this video, which gives some really good generic tips as to learning the game and becoming much better at World of Tanks. And I will see you in that one. Goodbye.